What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved and iconic comedians, a man whose very presence has brought laughter to millions of people across the globe, sits down for what should be a simple, light-hearted television interview, only to find himself facing unexpected hostility and relentless criticism from a host who seems determined, almost single-mindedly, to tear him down? That's exactly the scenario that unfolded on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning, when Jim Carrey, known for his boundless energy, his unmistakable grin, and his sharp comedic instincts, arrived at the studio to appear on The View. He had come with the usual expectations: a friendly chat about his latest project, some playful banter, the occasional joke or quip about his legendary roles, and the kind of warmth and lightheartedness that audiences around the world had come to associate with his appearances. What he got, however, was something entirely different, something that would escalate quickly into a tense and unforgettable confrontation, leaving viewers, staff, and even his fellow panelists visibly on edge. The studio was buzzing as Jim Carrey walked in, his presence commanding attention even before he took his seat. The bright lights of the stage reflected off the polished surfaces, illuminating the vibrant colors of the set and casting a warm glow over the audience. Jim's expression was cheerful, a grin spreading across his face as he greeted the hosts and waved to the audience. He exuded his usual charm and charisma, the kind that instantly puts people at ease and makes them laugh without effort. Yet, beneath that exterior, there was an unmistakable sense of anticipation. He was ready to discuss his work, his creative journey, and perhaps even offer a glimpse into his philosophical musings on art and life, topics he had become increasingly passionate about in recent years. But the moment the cameras began rolling and the interview formally started, it became clear that the conversation was heading in a direction Jim had not anticipated. Joy Behar, a veteran of countless televised interviews and debates, leaned forward in her chair with an expression that carried a subtle but unmistakable edge. Her voice, warm yet pointed, broke the initial light-hearted atmosphere. "So, Jim," she began, pausing just long enough to ensure her words carried weight, "let's talk about your recent comments regarding the entertainment industry. Some people are calling them unhinged." The word hung in the air like a challenge, and the audience sensed immediately that this was no ordinary interview. There was an intensity to her tone, a probing quality that suggested she intended to dig deep, to question, and perhaps even to confront, rather than simply entertain. Jim's smile faltered ever so slightly, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. For a moment, the playful, relaxed demeanor that he often carried into interviews seemed to waver, as if he were recalibrating, preparing himself for a discussion that was rapidly veering into uncomfortable territory. "Well, Joy," he said carefully, choosing his words with deliberate precision, "I think when you've been in this business as long as I have, you start to see things differently. You see the machinery behind the magic, and sometimes that can be eye-opening." There was a faint pause as he studied her expression, almost as though testing the waters, trying to gauge whether the conversation could remain civil. But Joy was not in the mood for subtlety. Her next words, sharp and unyielding, cut across the room. "Because to a lot of people," she said, her voice rising slightly with intensity, "it sounds like you've completely lost touch with reality." The tension in the studio became palpable. The other hosts exchanged glances, some uncomfortable, others concerned, while the audience held its collective breath. Whoopi Goldberg, seated nearby, shifted slightly in her seat, an almost imperceptible frown forming as she tried to read the situation. Sarah Haynes looked down at her notes, perhaps hoping to find a way to intervene diplomatically, while Sunny Host raised a skeptical eyebrow at the confrontational tone that Joy had adopted. The atmosphere, once light and jovial, had transformed into a battlefield of words and ideals, and it was becoming increasingly clear that Jim Carrey was not going to back down easily. "I'm sorry," Jim said, his voice steady but firm, carrying just enough edge to indicate his growing frustration. "Are we having an interview here, or an interrogation? Because I thought I was coming on to talk about my work, not to be psycho-analyzed by someone who's never walked in my shoes." His words resonated with authority, and the audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shift from playful banter to serious confrontation. Joy, undeterred, waved her hand dismissively as if brushing off his protest. "Oh, please," she scoffed, leaning slightly forward, her tone a mixture of incredulity and derision. "Spare us the victim act. Jim, you come on these shows, you make these bizarre statements about Hollywood conspiracies and spiritual awakenings, and then you get upset when someone calls you out on it." The phrase "bizarre statements" seemed to strike a chord. Jim's voice rose just enough to convey both indignation and a sense of wounded pride. "Bizarre statements, Joy," he repeated, his eyes narrowing slightly as he leaned forward in his own chair. "I've been nothing but honest about my experiences. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe the problem isn't with what I'm saying." There was a quiet, deliberate power in his words, a calm defiance that contrasted with the fiery intensity of his accuser. The audience, sensing the gravity of the exchange, became completely silent. Even the cameras, trained to capture every angle, seemed to pause in anticipation of what would come next. Joy, clearly unwilling to relent, pressed on with her critique. "Honest Jim, you've claimed that celebrities are all puppets in some grand scheme. You've talked about ego death and cosmic consciousness like you're some kind of guru. Do you realize how that sounds to normal people?" The word "normal" seemed to hang in the air, almost accusatory, as if implying that Jim's world, you was somehow aberrant or detached from reality. Jim's eyes flashed with something between hurt and anger, his voice firm and measured as he responded. "Normal people, Joy, with all due respect, I don't think you get to decide what's normal for anyone. I've had experiences that have changed my perspective on life, on fame, on what really matters. If sharing that honestly makes me sound crazy to you, then so be it." By this point, the studio audience was fully absorbed. Every movement, every word, every glance carried weight. Cameramen adjusted their positions to ensure that no reaction went unnoticed, capturing the intensity of a moment that was far removed from the usual scripted and safe conversations typically seen on daytime television. Joy, feeling the momentum of the confrontation, pressed even harder. "Jim, you made millions of dollars entertaining people, and now you want to bite the hand that fed you. You want to tell everyone that the industry that made you rich and famous is somehow evil or corrupt. Don't you see the contradiction here?" Her words were deliberate, loaded with accusation, and they seemed to challenge not just Jim's statements, but his very credibility. Jim, remaining composed despite the mounting tension, leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression hardening but his voice calm. "I'm not biting anyone's hand," he said slowly, each word carefully enunciated. "I'm simply speaking my truth. I've lived a life in the spotlight, seen the ins and outs, the highs and the lows, and what I'm sharing comes from that experience. It's not a vendetta, it's not an attack, it's perspective, and perspective, by definition, is subjective." The audience murmured softly in appreciation of his measured response, sensing the depth behind his words. The confrontation, however, was far from over. Joy, sensing that she still had the upper hand in the eyes of many viewers, leaned forward once again, her gaze fixed on Jim with unwavering intensity, perspective or not. She said, "You're walking a fine line between insight and delusion. Millions of people look up to you, and when you start talking about conspiracies, spiritual awakenings, and Hollywood corruption, it can sound like you've completely lost touch with reality." Her words were precise, cutting, and aimed squarely at challenging both his credibility and his intentions. Jim Carrey's reaction, though restrained, carried a quiet fury, a mix of frustration and disbelief. "Joy," he said firmly, "I respect that you're asking questions. I respect that you have your opinions, but what I won't do is allow my experiences, my insights, and my truths to be invalidated simply because they don't conform to someone else's idea of reality. I came here to talk about my work, my art, and my journey. If that conversation is going to be hijacked by judgment, then perhaps this isn't the place for it." There was a pause, a heavy silence that seemed to stretch across the studio as the audience absorbed the gravity of the exchange. And then, in a moment that stunned everyone in the room, Jim Carrey rose from his chair. Without another word, he walked off the set, leaving a stunned panel, a silent audience, and a swirl of camera angles capturing the dramatic exit. It was a moment that would be replayed countless times on social media, dissected by fans and critics alike, and remembered as one of the most intense, unfiltered confrontations in daytime television history. A rare glimpse of a man refusing to compromise his truth in the face of relentless interrogation. The incident left the studio in a state of shock. Panelists exchanged bewildered glances, the audience murmured softly, and staff behind the scenes moved quickly to restore order and continue filming. Jim Carrey, meanwhile, had made his point with unmistakable clarity. Honesty, perspective, and lived experience are not negotiable. His departure was not a surrender, it was a statement, a reminder that even in the most controlled, high-pressure environments of television, truth and authenticity hold their own power. It was a confrontation that would live on in the annals of interview history, remembered not just for the clash of personalities, but for the courage it took to stand firm, speak one's truth, and leave on one's own terms. The words lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating, like a dense, poisonous cloud that neither of them could ignore. For a long moment, Jim simply stared at Joy, letting her statement wash over him, his expression cycling through a sequence of emotions, as if he were watching an internal slideshow of feelings he hadn't fully confronted until now. Hurt flickered across his face first, subtle but undeniable, a shadow that passed too quickly for anyone to mistake it. Then came anger, rising like a tide beneath the surface, powerful and dangerous, but still contained. His jaw tightened, a reflexive signal of his frustration and disbelief. Disappointment followed swiftly, a slow, sinking realization that perhaps the person in front of him, someone whose role was meant to be jovial and engaging, had just stripped away a layer of his humanity. Finally, his eyes softened, settling into something that looked almost like pity, a strange empathy that emerged not for Joy, but for the broader truth of what she had just said. Another character, he repeated softly, almost to himself, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. Another character. Joy's eyes met his, a mixture of defiance and detachment that she wore like armor. What if I told you? Jim continued, his voice barely above a whisper, yet resonant with quiet intensity, that all those characters I played, every single one of those roles that made people laugh, that brought joy to millions, that made me a household name, those were just performances. What if the person sitting here right now, trying to have an honest conversation about what it means to be human, what if that person is actually the real me? He leaned slightly forward, his gaze piercing. There was a vulnerability there, raw and unpolished, a stark contrast to the polished persona he had cultivated for decades on stages and screens around the world. Joy shrugged, almost dismissively, her voice tinged with a casual cruelty. Then I'd say the real you is a lot less entertaining than the fake version. The silence that followed was deafening, as though the very air around them had been drained of sound. Jim sat motionless, his mind racing to process the sharp, cold truth in her words. His fingers fidgeted with the edges of his jacket for a few seconds, the faint rustle of fabric the only sound punctuating the void. When he finally looked up, his eyes had changed. There was a clarity there, a piercing lucidity that hadn't been present before. It was the kind of look that stripped away pretense, the sort that demanded honesty in return. "You know what, Joy?" he said, his voice calm now but carrying an unmistakable finality, like a gavel striking a courtroom. "You just proved everything I've been trying to say about this industry. You've just demonstrated, in one simple, cruel sentence, exactly why so many people in entertainment are miserable. You've shown why they turn to substances, why they have breakdowns, why they sometimes lose themselves entirely, why some even take their own lives." Joy opened her mouth, a reflexive attempt to respond, but Jim raised a hand, a gentle yet firm gesture that commanded silence. "No, let me finish. This is important." He paused, letting each word sink in before he continued. "You just told me that the real me, the authentic me, is less entertaining than the fake version. Do you understand the weight of that statement? Think about it. You've just told a human being that their authentic self, every scar, every struggle, every thought and feeling that makes them who they are, has less value than the performance they put on for others. That is the exact embodiment of the toxic mind. Said I've spent my life warning people about. Around them, The other hosts shifted uncomfortably. Whoopi shook her head with a visible grimace, while Sarah looked genuinely distressed, her hands folded tensely in her lap as though bracing for impact. The air had shifted, thick with tension, and all eyes were on Joy, waiting for her to retract or clarify. Jim's gaze remained fixed on her. "You didn't mean it like that," Joy began, her voice faltering under the intensity of his stare. "Yes, you did," Jim replied, his tone unwavering. "You meant it exactly like that, and that, Joy, that attitude, that belief that people are only valuable when they are performing for your amusement, that is exactly the kind of destructive mindset that fuels misery in this industry. That's exactly why I had to step away. That's exactly why I had to strip away every role, every mask, and find out who I really was underneath all those characters. Because the truth is, being human, being authentic, is far more difficult than being funny, far more vulnerable than being entertaining, and yet it is infinitely more valuable." Joy's face flushed now, a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and perhaps a fleeting sense of guilt. "Jim, you're being overly dramatic. I was simply pointing out that your fans fell in love with your comedic work, not your philosophical musings," she said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "My philosophical rambling," Jim echoed, the words rolling off his tongue with a subtle, bitter humor, though his smile was far from pleasant. "You call what I've shared with you, my life story, my struggles, my journey, the parts of me that are real and unpolished, the parts that aren't a joke or a punchline rambling. Let me remind you, Joy, I grew up in poverty, I struggled with trauma, I lost myself in fame, in the trappings of success, and I fought tooth and nail to rediscover my authentic self. And you dismiss that, you trivialize it, you reduce it to rambling." The room fell into a heavy silence once more. Jim stood slowly, deliberately, each movement measured, purposeful. He reached for the small microphone clipped to his jacket, his fingers trembling ever so slightly, not from fear, but from the raw intensity of feeling that had built up over years of suppression. "You know what?" he continued, his voice rising just enough to carry through the studio. "This is exactly why I don't do many interviews anymore. This is exactly why I've withdrawn from the spotlight at times, because too often people are not interested in the truth, in the human being behind the mask. They want entertainment. They want a show. They want a version of you that is safe, palatable, and amusing, even if it comes at the cost of your soul. And I am not willing to compromise my authenticity for anyone, not now, not ever." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over everyone in the room. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every micro-expression, every flicker of discomfort and awe. Jim's eyes glinted with a mixture of pain and liberation, a man finally standing in his truth, refusing to be diminished by superficial judgment. And with that he stepped back slightly, his posture relaxed yet resolute, as if the very act of speaking this truth had exercised years of internalized pressure. The air remained thick with tension, but there was also a strange sense of clarity now, a momentary peace born from confrontation and honesty. Jim Carrey had, in that moment, revealed something far more profound than any punchline or performance: the immeasurable value of the authentic self, and the courage it takes to protect it against a world that so often demands spectacle over substance. The tension in the studio was palpable, an almost tangible weight that pressed down on everyone present. It was the kind of tension that made the air feel thick, each word spoken vibrating with more meaning than usual, every gesture magnified in the collective consciousness of the audience. Jim Carrey sat there, composed but with a quiet intensity that suggested a storm brewing just beneath the surface. He had come on this show with one intention: to discuss his latest work, to connect with his audience, and to share a glimpse of the person behind the performances. Yet as the interview progressed, he realized that his expectations were colliding violently with the reality before him. "This is exactly why I'm selective about the platforms I choose to share my thoughts on," he thought, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "Because there are people who interpret vulnerability as weakness, growth as nonsense, and authenticity as some lesser form of entertainment. People like Joy, who seemed incapable, or perhaps unwilling, to see that the world was not merely a stage for performance, but a space for genuine human connection." Her words, meant to challenge, began to feel like a barrier, an invisible wall erected between them, a wall built from judgment, assumptions, and the desire to provoke. Joy noticed the shift in his demeanor, her confidence starting to waver as Jim's calm yet commanding presence filled the space. She had been prepared to assert control, to maintain the semblance of authority over the conversation, but the air had shifted, and it was clear that she was losing it. Every attempt she made to corner him, every question designed to unsettle him, seemed only to illuminate her lack of understanding. The microphone she wielded like a weapon suddenly felt heavy, almost burdensome, as if it were a tangible reminder of the misalignment between her intentions and reality. "We could have had a civilized conversation," Jim said, carefully detaching the microphone from his jacket with deliberate calm, his tone precise but carrying the weight of disappointment. Civilized, respectful, constructive, those were the words that should have defined this interaction. But instead, you chose to turn this into an attack. You chose to mock my journey, my experiences, my growth. You chose to tell me in no uncertain terms that the real me, the person behind the laughter, behind the art, behind the struggles and triumphs, is somehow inadequate, unworthy of your audience. The sting in his voice was subtle but undeniable. It was a mixture of hurt and indignation, of someone who had spent years navigating the complexities of fame and human connection, only to encounter a mirror reflecting nothing but misunderstanding. Whoopi Goldberg, sensing the escalation, intervened with her signature calm but firm demeanor. "Jim, please, let's just take a breath here. We can start over." Her voice was a stabilizing force, a gentle attempt to anchor the situation before it spiraled further. Jim turned his gaze to her, and for a brief moment, the tension in his posture softened. "Whoopi," he said, respect lacing each syllable, "you are a class act, and I have nothing but admiration for you. But I am not going to sit here and allow someone to dismantle my character while hiding behind the guise of journalism." "This isn't journalism," he continued, voice rising slightly with conviction. "This is bullying." Joy, now visibly agitated, rose to her feet, her voice straining to maintain authority amidst the chaos. "Bullying. Jim, you came on this show to promote your work," she said, the pitch of her voice climbing in frustration. "Part of that means being able to handle tough questions about your public statements, your career, and your ideas. If you can't handle that, perhaps interviews of this nature aren't suitable for you." But Jim only laughed, a hollow, unamused sound devoid of the levity his audience had come to associate with him. "You attacked my mental state," he said, each word deliberate, sharp, and precise. "You dismissed my experiences, mocked my journey, and suggested that I am somehow less valuable as a human being when I am authentic than I am as a performer. These aren't questions. These are insults wrapped in the pretense of journalism." The studio audience, until now an invisible presence, became acutely aware of the gravity of the exchange. Phones were raised, lenses focused, the subtle buzz of recording devices blending into the silence. Everyone sensed they were witnessing something unprecedented, a collision of celebrity, media, and raw human emotion, played out live on television. The atmosphere was electric, tense, and almost impossible to breathe in, as if the walls themselves were straining to contain the intensity of what was happening. Joy's tone sharpened further, her voice bordering on shrill. "You're being incredibly unprofessional," she accused, her words carrying across the room with the force of her indignation. "This is live television. You can't simply walk away because you dislike the direction the conversation has taken." Jim's expression softened, but his eyes retained the quiet fire of someone who had seen too much, felt too deeply, and would no longer remain passive. "Joy," he said softly, but with an undeniable firmness, "do you know what's truly unprofessional? Inviting someone onto your show under the pretense of promoting their work, only to spend the entire time attempting to tear them down personally. Using your platform not to engage with ideas, not to foster dialogue, but to attack character, to belittle, to reduce someone to a caricature designed for public consumption." Turning toward the cameras, Jim addressed the audience directly, his voice carrying across the studio and into the homes of millions. "You know what, folks," he said, his tone earnest and tinged with sadness. "This right here is exactly what I've been talking about. This is the kind of environment that pervades parts of this industry, a space where people are valued only for their capacity to entertain, where authenticity is treated as a flaw, where personal growth is ridiculed rather than celebrated. The silence that followed was heavy, thick, as if the studio itself were absorbing the gravity of his words. Joy, realizing that the audience's attention had shifted almost entirely to Jim, tried to regain control, but her words sounded increasingly desperate. "Jim, you are making a scene. This is unnecessary," she insisted, her authority waning under the weight of the moment. "Making a scene?" Jim's voice rose, but not in anger, only in clarity and conviction. "Joy," he said, the words precise and cutting, "you spent the last 15 minutes making a scene. You turned what should have been a pleasant, constructive conversation into a platform for character assassination. I am merely refusing to participate in it any longer." Finally, Sarah Haynes, with her calm, measured demeanor, attempted one last olive branch. "Jim, perhaps we could shift the focus. Maybe we can talk about your upcoming projects. I know you have some exciting things in the works," she said, trying to create a bridge back to the original purpose of the interview. Jim's expression softened, a small smile playing on his lips. "Sarah," he said warmly, "you seem like a genuinely nice person, someone who understands the importance of dialogue, of authenticity, and perhaps, just perhaps, what it means to allow someone to be fully seen, without judgment or ridicule." In that moment, the studio held its collective breath, witnessing not just a celebrity defending himself, but a profound assertion of the human need to be recognized, respected, and heard. Jim's words, carefully measured yet brimming with emotion, reverberated through the room, a reminder that the core of every performance, every public persona, every carefully curated image, is the human being behind it, flawed, striving, and profoundly authentic.